As deputies know, Sinn Féin was and continues to be against the local property tax, and when you look back at it, it's probably the worst or one of the most poorly designed taxes that was ever introduced in the history of the state. It was a tax not only on an asset but a debt. Anybody who is in negative equity or who continues to be in negative equity is still charged the same as if they were sitting on an asset. It charges people who are asset rich but income poor, particularly older people in rural parts of Ireland who may have a property with a higher value but simply don't have the income to service the tax. It penalises those who aren't able to pay. The Minister conveniently forgot to mention, of course, that there's a 4% annual interest charge on the deferral, and that accumulates year on year. That seems to be a particularly callous way to allow people to defer it. And crucially, contrary to what was claimed at the time, there was no extra money to local authorities. Those of us that were in local authorities at the time, euro for euro, as grants for roads and housing was taken away, it was replaced by the local property tax. In fact, during that period of time, some key services were removed from local authorities, such as water and waste management. So, in fact, not only are people paying more, but they're paying more for less services. And one of the reasons why we'll be enthusiastically supporting the bill in front of us is because people in multi-unit developments are paying on the double. The Minister is absolutely wrong in his speech where he talks about how people who pay management charges are paying those for other things that regular homeowners have to pay out of their own pocket. In fact, some of the insurance costs for people in multi-unit developments don't exist in standard standalone houses. But also the average cost of management charges, particularly, for example, in Dublin and the commuter belt, is 3 or 4 times the average local property tax charge. So while, yes, it sometimes does include bins, for example, those are things that are included in addition to the cost that Deputy O'Brien rightly raised. Of course, our view is, look, the local property tax itself should be scrapped. We've argued strongly it should be phased out over 3 years. The cost of that would be about 155 million annually, and I'm sure Deputy Canny will be delighted to know we've set out exactly where that revenue could be got through parliamentary questions. So, for example, we could start to fairly tax excessively high earners, taper out tax credits on incomes over 100,000. That would give you somewhere in the region of 185 million a year. You could introduce a 5% income levy on income over 140,000. That would give you 310 million euros a year. Or indeed, you could have, as many other successful European economies have, a wealth tax on net assets in excess of 1 million euros. Michael Noonan, some years ago in this House, said such a tax could actually raise in excess of 500 million euros a year. So when you have a bad tax, you don't keep it, you scrap it and you find better ways to replace it, and that's what Sinn Féin has and will continue to propose. With respect to the bill, and I think it's a good bill, and Sinn Féin, as I said, is happy to support it, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of occupants of multi-unit developments, many of whom are paying between 1,000 and, in some parts of Dublin, 2,000 euros annually in management fees in addition to the local property tax. Many of these are people struggling to pay mortgages, they're struggling with rising costs of living, childcare, healthcare, etc. And this is simply an additional burden which unfairly they have to bear. And it's important to understand what they pay for. When you pay your management fee, it includes maintenance of open space, and that includes cutting of grass, something that the council would ordinarily do in residential council estates and private estates. It covers street lighting, repairs to paths and roads, again something that would ordinarily be covered by the local authorities in standard urban housing estates, public or private. And on that basis, I think it is legitimate to say there's an element of double charging here. In fact, people who are paying management fees and the local property tax are paying for services which they don't get because the council don't provide them in those large multi-unit developments. We even actually have in some of our mixed developments householders also paying, albeit a lower level of management fee as well as the local property tax, which is equally unfair. I do think it's a very sensible provision of the bill that it will only apply to principal private residences. Landlords obviously generate an income and they can look after the LTPT from that. But what I would also say is, and I again echo Deputy O'Brien's points, many of the people who are paying this charge are struggling with other difficulties. Latent defects. We're seeing a significant increase in the number of homeowners who, through no fault of their own, are in properties with latent defects that are now going to cost them somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 euros to rectify, whether it's fire safety, water ingress, etc. And while the government continues to tell us that this is really a matter between the home purchaser and the seller, those latent defects were only possible because of a regulatory regime which was essentially a self-regulation which this House approved and this House stood over for far too many years. So the government does have some level of responsibility and culpability in that, and the fact that it continues to bury its head in the sand and refuse to give some level of support to those in properties with latent defects, I think is deeply regrettable. It also has to be said, and again, both myself and Deputy O'Brien have raised these points at the Housing Committee, there does need to be a fundamental review of the way in which management companies and multi-unit developments are run. The Apartment Owners Network, a fantastic voluntary network of apartment owners, have made multiple submissions to Government and to the Oireachtas Housing Committee, urging Government to look at how they can be better equipped and supported to do the job that the Multi-Unit Development Act has given them. And it's not all about money. Some of what they're asking for is support. They want training, they want professionalisation, they want assistance in terms of ensuring that when they're on management companies, they're able to deal with the complexities of governance and management, something which government could easily support them with. And they also want assistance to accessing finance, and what they're not looking for is a handout, but, for example, low-interest finance through Home Building Finance Ireland to fund remedial works or to assist in the provision of sinking funds. Now, obviously, they're beyond the scope of this bill, but I think it is right to raise those broader issues. But small and all as the measure contained in this piece of legislation is, it would send out a clear signal that government actually recognises that people in multiple unit developments need some assistance, and a small bit of financial assistance would be the right start. So I have to say there is nothing in what the Minister said that I think stands up to any credible scrutiny, which is why Sinn Féin will be happy to support this bill. And when it comes to committee, we'll be supporting the Deputy, ensuring we get through all stages as quickly as possible to give struggling homeowners a bit of a hand up as well. Thanks, Cian Curlin.